This is 1A. I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for checking us out today. Before the nation settles in for the Super Bowl, let's tackle what's been going on in the news this week. It's the U.S. edition of the Friday News Roundup.
I made a promise to the American people. If I were elected president, I would find the very best judge in the country for the Supreme Court.
I think the president is within his rights here to fire the attorney general, that he has that ability.
This idea that these nominees have not been properly vetted, that they haven't been asked tough questions, that's just nonsense. That's nonsense on a stick.
6 more weeks of winter, it shall be. He has spoken.
Joining us to try and make sense of the week's news is Ed O'Keefe, congressional correspondent at The Washington Post. Ed, welcome to 1A.
Great to be with you.
Alex Simendinger is White House correspondent for Real Clear Politics. Alexis, welcome.
Well, thanks.
And Jonathan Wiseman is deputy Washington editor for The New York Times and the author of the novel Number 4 Imperial Lane. Jonathan, glad to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Do send in your questions and stories about this week's national news. Email us 1a@wamu.org. Comment on our Facebook page, tweet us at 1a, and you can watch the live video stream of this hour online at the1a.org. That's the word the number 1, the letter a.org. Let's begin with President Trump's cabinet. There was news early this morning that Betsy DeVos, the president's pick to become the new Secretary of Education, was being advanced through a Senate committee at an early morning hearing that was taking place today. The timeline looks like that might go to the full Senate on Monday. How significant, Jonathan Wiseman, was this event?
It wasn't very significant. I mean, because the Democrats in 2013 ended filibusters of almost all appointees. Really, this vote was to cut off debate, but there was no question that it was going to happen. And in fact, the 52 votes that Betsy DeVos got today to cut off debate was deceptive. In fact, two Republican senators, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, voted yes today, but plan to vote no next week when Betsy DeVos's actual confirmation comes up. So where we stand right now is a 50-50 Senate on DeVos and Mike Pence actually casting the tie-breaking vote.
Before I let Ed chime in, why would they vote yes today and no later?
You know, on procedural votes, the parties like to stick together. And I'm sure that they said, Mitch McConnell, I'll stick with you here, but I'm not going to stick with you in the end.
Ed O'Keefe?
Yeah, first off, this was an early morning vote in the full Senate. The committee had already pushed her out earlier in the week, so we should just clarify that. That makes it even rarer that they would be holding a, not even a breakfast time Senate vote, but sort of like an early morning coffee vote. And look, Mike Pence looks like he's going to have to cast a tie-breaking vote next week. He would be the first vice president to do that since Cheney did it back, I think, in the early years of the Bush administration, and he'd be the first vice president to have to cast a tie-breaking vote on a cabinet nominee. That's how rancorous things have become in the Senate, that now cabinet nominees that normally fly through with a lot of votes can't find them. And there's a good chance on one or two of these other ones down the line that he may have to cast another tie-breaking vote.
Alexis, what do you make of that kind of division in which you have more senators saying, I'm sorry, I know that you are the nominee chosen by my party's president, but I just can't support you?
Well, in this particular case, I think what came through were the two senators that Jonathan were mentioning had concerns about the nominee in terms of her position on public schooling. They expressed those concerns. They tried to get reassurance from her. She's considered a school choice advocate. She's obviously a billionaire, very wealthy donor to the Republican Party. I mean, it would not necessarily have been easy for them to go against it. But the other element I think we should mention is that Betsy DeVos did not perform very well in her confirmation hearings. So she had the opportunity to dig herself out, and she did not.
Susan Collins actually said that it was the worst performance she had ever seen by a nominee. She was unprepared. She kind of became a joke when she said that there should be at times they need guns in schools to battle grizzlies. And the big thing that she did was she didn't understand that the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, IDEA, which is the Special Education Act, was a federal law that needed to be administered by the Education Department. That really stuck into the craw of these two senators, but also out in the country. I mean, the switchboards at the Capitol have been flooded with calls about Betsy DeVos. Much of it has been orchestrated by the teachers' unions, but not all of it. She really is a very polarizing nominee.
And the remark that she mentioned about grizzly bears, Senator Chris Murphy, who's a Democrat from Connecticut, had asked her, basically, do you think there's any circumstance under which guns are appropriate on campus? And she referenced a previous senator's comment about really rural schools in very, very rural areas that might need to protect themselves from wildlife, which was what led her to refer back to that comment and say, maybe grizzly bears, not thinking perhaps that Senator Murphy's purview includes Newtown, where the Sandy Hook massacre took place, which I think made his face drop as soon as she said that. Moving on to other members of the cabinet, Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly. He was asked about President Trump's plans to build a wall along the Mexico-U.S. border, and he said that he expects that could be done within the next 2 years. Where do we stand now in terms of the process of making that happen, finding the funding for the wall? Has that moved forward at all?
Well, finding the funding is what's going to make this probably a 2-year effort to find it, and then maybe begin construction. This is an issue that while Republicans, in theory and in words, like the idea of building this wall and want to make good on the president's promise, the enormous cost of it, and it could stretch into the tens of billions of dollars, is something that they're very uncomfortable with because, of course, for the last 8 years, even longer than that, they've been saying, you want to pay for something expensive, we got to find something else to cut. Well, this is a president who's generating all sorts of ideas that are quite expensive, and it's going to test the fiscal conservatives in this party. The argument over whether or not Mexico pays for it, or if there's a way one day that the president can at least walk away and say, see, they did pay for it because this happened, that's still up for debate, and we know was part of the subject of conversation in a phone call that the president had with Enrique Peña Nieto this week about the future of the relations between the two countries and border security specifically.
Did anything actually move forward this week in terms of finding that funding, or is it all kind of just political talk at this point?
There was a meeting yesterday at the White House between the heads of the two tax writing committees in the House and the Senate and President Trump. And a big part of that was talking about how imports are going to be taxed. It's a very obscure debate about something called a border adjustment tax. But apparently, Trump moved a little towards the House on this way of taxation. And it's kind of a fig leaf way of saying, well, if we tax imports, we'll say some of the money that we're taxing from imports from Mexico could go pay for the wall. It's nonsense. I mean, all of the imports would be taxed. You cannot actually tax imports from a particular country like that without running afoul of international rules. But in the search for fig leaves, they might be finding one.
The other element of that meeting that was interesting is that these lawmakers are also spending time trying to talk the president out of things that he is very wedded to. So it's almost like the first stage of what Jonathan is talking about is not just getting him to embrace something that Congressman Brady, the Chairman Brady, is interested in, but also getting him to walk away from something he was interested in, which was up to a 35% tariff, a border tariff, which Republicans by and large think is a bad idea, and many, many, many private businesses think it's a bad idea. The oil industry, retailers, not super keen on that. So it's interesting to watch the first stage and then the second stage.
That's Alexis Simendinger, White House correspondent for Real Clear Politics, with us on the U.S. edition of the Friday News Roundup, along with Ed O'Keefe of the Washington Post and Jonathan Wiseman of the New York Times. And with you, we would like your questions and thoughts and stories about the U.S. news of this week. Email us 1a@wamu.org, tweet us at 1a, or comment on our Facebook page. I do want to talk about the Supreme Court nominee that was put forward this week. We're up against a break in a few minutes, but at least we can start talking about it. The nominee is Judge Neil Gorsuch of the Federal Appeals Court in Colorado. He seems to be, by all accounts, a conservative's conservative with very solid conservative bona fides, somewhere around the legal philosophy of Antonin Scalia, possibly a little further to the right, depending on which analyses of his legal views you read or consider. What's going to happen going forward with Neil Gorsuch? Where do things stand now, and what's the next step? Well,
I mean, I would defer to my congressional colleague at first, but I will say that this is going to be all-out war. But the Democrats are in a terrible position because they can sit and they can try to filibuster him, and if they do, then as President Trump said, Go nuclear, Mitch. They can always just change the rules and stop the filibuster for Supreme Court justices. So the Democrats just don't have much of a leg to stand on.
And you kind of alluded to it just now, but just to be clear, what does going nuclear actually mean?
To Ed.
Going nuclear would be to invoke the so-called nuclear option, which essentially allows the majority party to change the rules of the Senate in a way that would allow the majority party to confirm a Supreme Court nominee on a simple majority vote.
So instead of 60 votes,
it'd be 51, basically, or a majority of those present in the room, if you want to get really technical, and I know listeners like to do that. They did this, Democrats did a few years ago when it was Republicans holding up the nominations of a few federal court judges, and now it's come back to bite them. This is why Rex Tillerson, John Kelly, James Mattis, Betsy DeVos, most likely next week, are getting through with very little resistance because the rule was changed when it comes to cabinet nominees. And if Democrats fight them, Republicans are threatening to do it for the Supreme Court, which would essentially, make the Senate a fancier version of the House in some ways.
We'll continue with this conversation on the other side of the break with Ed O'Keefe of The Washington Post, Alexis Simendinger of Real Clear Politics, and Jonathan Wiseman of The New York Times. Still to come, plenty to talk about: the travel ban, more on the Supreme Court, the prayer breakfast, campus protests. I would really appreciate one slow week of the news, but it ain't this week, so we'll help you make sense of it as best we can. I'm Joshua Johnson, glad to be with you. You're listening to 1A from WAMU and NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Inada, creators of the Japanese-made Dreamwave massage chair with shiatsu point detection and 16 programmed massages, including morning and nighttime sessions. Retail dealers nationwide. More at dreamwavechair.com. From 3M Health Information Systems and Verily, working to improve insights and outcomes across health delivery systems and patient populations. Learn more at 3m.com/pophealth. And from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
This is 1A's Friday News Roundup. I'm Joshua Johnson, spending the hour with Ed O'Keefe of The Washington Post, Alexis Simendinger of Real Clear Politics, Jonathan Wiseman of The New York Times, and with you. We'll get to some of your questions and thoughts about the week's national news. But first, I want to keep talking a little bit more about Neil Gorsuch, this nominee for the U.S. Supreme Court. President Donald Trump held a press conference on Tuesday evening to announce Mr. Gorsuch as his pick.
When Justice Scalia passed away suddenly last February, I made a promise to the American people. If I were elected president, I would find the very best judge in the country for the Supreme Court. I promised to select someone who respects our laws and is representative of our Constitution and who loves our Constitution, and someone who will interpret them as written. Today, I am keeping another promise to the American people by nominating Judge Neil Gorsuch of the United States Supreme Court to be of the United States Supreme Court.
That's President Trump speaking on Tuesday. What kind of impact do we expect Judge Gorsuch might have on the U.S. Supreme Court? What do we know about his record that might presage why his supporters might say that he's the right pick?
You know, one of the things I think Jonathan was talking about, I guess the big flare-up in the fight, the battle, the war that's going to take place. But actually, it's a warm-up for the act to come. So in this particular case, Judge Gorsuch is most likely going to get through. There's nothing that's appeared so far to indicate that it would be disqualifying to get to the threshold that he's looking for. And as we were talking about, Democrats have to make a decision. But it's a warm-up for them because it's not that the 5-4 that existed with Antonin Scalia is going to change in terms of the way the bench was before he died last February. In this particular case, the warm-up is the next pick. And so what was interesting to me, I was in the room, I was watching the president do what I have watched previous presidents do, and it was a very traditionalist, it was a very mainstream establishment kind of presentation. And what occurred to me was that Donald Trump was also thinking about the pick to come. We know that Judge Gorsuch had been a clerk to Justice Kennedy. And the idea supposedly is, and I could see why this would be the case, look at this friendly face that going to join the court. This is what we assume would happen. And trying to indicate to the 80-year-old on the bench, if you're worried about retiring, if that's something you would like to do, which he's rumored to want to do, and he creates a vacancy, that Donald Trump would pick someone like this. In other words, in the establishment conservative world, it was just a hosanna, high fives for this particular nominee.
In this case, this is Justice Kennedy is the swing vote in the court. He's been the swing vote for a while now because Antonin Scalia held the seat that Gorsuch would go into. The signal here was to Kennedy that it would be safe to retire, and that yes. A lot of people have misgivings about Donald Trump, but he came through on this one. He'll come through again on the next one. You don't have to be crazy. You don't have to be worried that some crazy nominee will come, because if and when Kennedy retires, then you're looking at a major change. Of course, you also have two Democratic appointees on the Supreme Court that are also in their 80s, and either one of them leaving the court would be the big change.
Ed?
Gorsuch would be the first former Supreme Court clerk to serve with his former boss, if it happens.
Because Gorsuch clerked for Kennedy.
Clerk for Kennedy. It's never happened before, but certainly plenty of clerks have gone on to become judges in other high legal minds, but never have we seen one end up serving alongside his former boss. He's an originalist, so that's the cue to the Scalia style of being a judge.
And define that term. What is an originalist?
Oh, I knew you would ask that. Essentially, they look at the Constitution as an original document, and they go with the original interpretations of what it is the founding fathers wanted. It is a more conservative legal view, and that is why Scalia was so revered by legal conservatives for certain. This pick, I think it's important to keep in mind. From a judicial philosophy standpoint, he will be a Scalia, most likely, if you read his opinions and look at how he's ruled. But the way he will comport himself in the coming weeks will remind people a lot of John Roberts when he was chosen. And remember, John Roberts faced a lot of skepticism, but ultimately was confirmed in part because he performed so well at his confirmation hearings. He was poised, he was warm, he joked with the senators, he won them and the general public over. I suspect, and it looks like Gorsuch is setting himself up the same way. I talked to staffers for one of the moderate Democrats who met with him yesterday who said they were blown away at how poised he is, how prepared he is, and how prepared the team that is helping him get confirmed is to win over the moderate Democratic senators they're going to need to make it happen.
One of our listeners, Brian, in Bartlett, New Hampshire, emailed us, is there not already a Supreme Court nominee before Congress? Does the nomination of Merrick Garland end with President Obama's term?
It ends with the end of the Congress that concluded on the morning of January 3rd.
Exactly.
So it's not there anymore.
But the residual resentment over the treatment of Merrick
hasn't
Garland
gone away,
has not moved.
And the stench of it is still up there, I can tell you.
The sense...
I was trying not to use the word stench,
well,
but since you
I'll
went
use
there.
it because that's how a lot of Democrats feel is, look, you screwed us for the last year.
You stole
our seat. Then we're going to behave the same way. I talked to a liberal, what's his name, Cenk Uyghur with the Young Turks yesterday.
Cenk Uyghur from the Young Turks.
And he said, look, we should enact the McConnell rule, which is that you wait at least a year to have a nominee seated on the court, because that's what McConnell did to Merrick Garland.
Now, see, that's what I was gonna ask about, is whether or not this resentment, whether we have any clear signs, anyone who's actually saying something or doing something towards turning this resentment into action.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yes. I mean, Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, has said that because of what happened to Merrick Garland, that the next Supreme Court justice should be such a consensus pick that it gets 67 votes. And any number of Democrats have said that they need 60 votes. So there's the threat of a filibuster is very much already lodged. The question is how far they will go and what will happen to the 10 Democratic senators who stand for re-election in 2018 in states that Donald Trump won. How worried are they?
I should add, President Trump is so aware of the venom or the toxicity after the Merrick Garland situation that he did call Judge Garland, and Judge Garland then subsequently issued a statement about his feeling that he hoped that the Senate would, take up, would vote, and Merrick Garland was trying to encourage both parties, do the right thing, fill this vacancy, let's go.
I mean, one of the great quirks in all of this is that actually Judge Gorsuch had written about the ill treatment that nominees have faced in the Senate, and one of his examples was Merrick Garland. So.
Wow. Let's keep moving. Let's talk about the travel ban that has come up. It's been a week since President Trump signed the executive order that bars refugees from entering the U.S. It caught some green card holders, people with valid visas. A number of travelers who were in the air when the measure was signed were not able to enter the country. More recently, the acting U.S. Attorney General took a stand on that, and taking that stand, presumably before she would have been asked to leave for the new administration anyway, got her fired outright. What kind of fallout lingers from that? Is this basically done? Is there more yet to be dealt with? Alexis, where does this look like it's heading going forward?
Well, you called it a ban, so let's talk about part of the fallout is what do we call it? One of the interesting things that happened is that words do make a difference, and President Trump and Vice President Pence called it a ban. Then they tried to walk back from the ban, and then they walked towards the ban again. The fallout has been international. It's been on Capitol Hill. It's been in the agencies and departments. It has been among the American people. We have seen a poll that came out today. The Gallup poll indicates that a majority of Americans are not in favor of this, which is really interesting because before the election, polling indicated that a majority of Americans were very much in favor of an idea of securing the borders and keeping illegal migrants out and refugees out, accepting fewer refugees. So something about the way that the Trump administration presented this went off course, and they've been trying to walk it back since then. The additional repercussions of this, I would add, is not just what these orders themselves did, but what is to come. And what's happening in the administration is a discussion about the next steps on immigration. For instance, there are people in the White House who are very interested in maybe taking a step to ban illegal migrants, undocumented migrants, from being able to access benefits, federal, local, state benefits, if they could manage to do that in some way, or to prevent them from taking jobs that Americans are able to accept or to be candidates for. If the president wants to go in that direction, I would imagine the repercussions would continue, and we have seen Democrats, progressives take to the streets. We've seen demonstrations. We saw streets fill up, airports fill up, and lots of international discussion.
I think Alexis
before we keep going there, hang on just one second, Jonathan. I'll come back to you. You mentioned the Gallup poll. Just to clarify on what those numbers are, you're right in your assessment of them. Gallup found that among people who they asked whether people approved of this temporary ban on entry for people from 7 Muslim-majority countries. 42% approve, 55% disapprove. In terms of building the wall along the southern border with Mexico, 38% approve, 60% disapprove. In terms of indefinitely keeping Syrian refugees out, 36% approve, 58% disapprove, and the overall job approval rating right now is 43%.
For the president.
For the president, right.
What I was going to say is, as Alexa said, presentation matters. And the American people might have liked, theoretically, this idea, but they don't like chaos. And the zeitgeist out there is we are in this state of turmoil that is incredibly unsettling to most Americans. And there is this feeling like these things are being done without a lot of thought, without a lot of of planning, and
real people are being seen, right?
And real
5-year-old children, people crying at airports.
People's own doctors are saying, "Oh, I'm stuck in Iran right now." It's really hitting home, and there's a sense that things are spinning out of control.
I should also note, Gallup also asked whether people felt that the president is moving too fast in addressing the major problems the country faces. At this point, 47% of the people Gallup polled said that Donald Trump is moving too fast. That includes 73% of Democrats who say Trump is moving too fast. At this point in Barack Obama's first term, it was only 22% of Americans, but currently about 47% say that he is moving too fast. Let me get to a comment related to all of this. One commenter wrote on our website, defending the recent travel ban to Muslim countries, Kellyanne Conway cited a terrorist attack that never happened. The counselor to the president in an interview on MSNBC said that most people did not know about the Bowling Green massacre masterminded by 2 Iraqi refugees because of lack of media coverage. Now, let me clarify this just a little bit. Last night, Kellyanne Conway appeared on Hardball with Chris Matthews, and she said, give me just a moment, I'll pull up the exact quote. She said, "I bet it's brand new information to people that President Obama had a 6-month ban on the Iraqi refugee program after 2 Iraqis came here to this country, were radicalized, and they were the masterminds behind the Bowling Green massacre. Most people don't know that because it didn't get covered." Now, I do want to get your reaction to that after I tell you there are a number of untruths in that statement. President Obama did not ban Iraqi refugees for 6 months or at all. He slowed down the refugee program, but they were never banned. That did happen after 2 Iraqis were arrested and put in federal custody for attempting to aid terrorists overseas. They did have a history of being insurgents in Iraq, but they never killed anyone. They were in Bowling Green, Kentucky, but they were arrested and convicted on conspiracy to commit terrorist acts. No one ever died. That's why it wasn't covered, because it's untrue. It never happened. She told a whopper last night.
This is kind of the modus operandi of the White House. They take a very small kernel of truth, which is that 2 Iraqi refugees who had lived in Bowling Green had gone back to Iraq and tried to kill people, and then they inflate it into something called the Bowling Green massacre. There was no Bowling Green massacre. Nobody died. But, there's always this kernel of truth that floats around Breitbart and InfoWars, Alex Jones's organization, and they're speaking to an audience, but it's a very small audience.
But now, from a practical standpoint, how does this affect policy going forward? Yes, this is untrue. I mean, this is an untrue statement. But really, talk about what effect this has in terms of actually making decisions about immigration.
It's going to make it harder. This was an already emotionally fraught issue, and they've made it worse this past week by the chaos that it created and the fact that there were a lot of people on Capitol Hill and across the federal agencies who said, we were not consulted, we were not informed, we would have told them, look, you can do this, but you've got to think about X, Y, and Z before you do so. And it took about 4 days of the White House bringing Republicans to the White House or going up to Capitol Hill and holding their hand and singing mea culpa for them to finally go, okay, fine, this is great, we'll move forward. But they caused a lot of problems for themselves, even within their own party, and it's going to make it harder for this stuff to happen the way they want it to, if they expect it to happen at all.
Alexis?
One other thing I want to add is that I'm watching 2 weeks into being a White House correspondent covering Donald Trump after covering previous presidents, is that there is a trend here beginning to develop, or at least one that I'm trying to pay attention to, where spokespeople for the administration, either the night before, hours before, the morning before, when other things are expected to happen, or maybe there's something else in the news that's negative, will throw something out there that is the shiny object that gets debunked or becomes a distraction. And in their mind, it seems to be a plus as opposed to the way we're describing it as almost like a negative. Why are they doing this? The plus part of it is that they understand that the news media, cable, or what they believe is maybe more progressive or left-leaning media will chase after this and dwell on it. Whereas today, also, the president is doing many other things. He is trying to tackle the Dodd-Frank financial reform law of 2010, which is a signature achievement that President Obama was proud of. He's trying to actually be more of a conformist on Iran sanctions. He is being more of a conformist on Russia policy. He is wrestling with Iran. These are major, significant things, but, we're not you, Josh, but we all in the media end up talking about sometimes these distracting things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Alexis makes a good point. The fact of the matter is that it was only a week ago that the travel ban came out, and in past administrations, especially the last one, these kind of furors lasted for days or weeks or months, and so much is happening that we just move on to the next thing. I mean, I was talking earlier that when Barack Obama weighed in after a Harvard professor, Skip Gates, was roughed up on his front porch for trying to get into his own house, Obama weighed in on Gates' side against the policeman. It created such an uproar that people actually, eventually the president had to sit down with the policeman and Skip Gates for their beer summit.
Yeah.
We just move on.
There's too much of it.
There aren't furors because there are just too many furors.
Well, and there's a lot of news that's breaking all day long, including news about new sanctions against Iran. I'm going to take this break to try to digest the information. We'll tell you all about that and get to more of your questions on the other side. Stay close. Next hour on 1A, we'll talk about the growing unrest in Ukraine, a botched raid in Yemen, as well as outrage at America's temporary travel ban from 7 mostly Muslim countries. Also, that phone call between the Australian Prime Minister and the President. It's the global edition of the Friday News Roundup, next hour on 1A.
Member stations. And from Audible, offering a selection of audiobooks including Grisham, Game of Thrones, J.K. Rowling, and Girl on the Train. Members can listen anytime, anywhere on smartphones or tablets with the Audible app. More at audible.com/listen. From Fidelity, offering wealth planning using a personal, dedicated relationship to help clients build, manage, and preserve their family's wealth. Learn more at fidelity.com/wealth. Fidelity Brokerage Services. And from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Before we get back to the Roundup, a quick reminder about a topic we're covering next week. We'd like to know whether you're feeling energized about this moment for America. A lot of people are diving in and getting involved to oppose or support the changes in Washington and elsewhere. A lot of people are burned out and want nothing to do with politics or activism right now. And some folks are just exhausted, maybe on both sides. What about you? How are you doing? Leave us a voicemail, 855-236-1037. 1A, 1A. Does this moment in America and the world have you feeling fired up or burned out? And how are you handling it? Tell us your story. 855-236-1A1A. That's 855-236-1212. You can also make a voice memo with your smartphone and email it to 1A@WAMU.org. We'll play some of your stories next week on 1A. Back to our conversation in the Friday News Roundup with Jonathan Wiseman of the New York Times, Alexis Simendinger of Real Clear Politics, and Ed O'Keefe of the Washington Post. Let me get now to the breaking news that is coming out of Washington regarding sanctions against Iran. The early read on what's happening is that the Trump administration this morning announced sanctions on 13 people and a dozen companies in response to the recent ballistic missile tests in Iran. The National Security Advisor Michael Flynn said earlier in the week that the administration was putting Iran on notice for the missile test on Sunday and for its support of Shiite rebels in Yemen. This morning, the president tweeted, quote, "Iran is playing with fire. They don't appreciate how kind President Obama was to them, not me," unquote. Now, this is early yet, and we're still waiting on some of the details, but what's the early read about how Iran's came up politically this week and what this might mean going forward? Ed?
This is getting thumbs up from Republicans who've been pushing the president to do this. And it's consistent with how the Obama administration was handling these types of things. If there was some kind of a violation, they would respond with sanctions in kind, and that appears to be what the new administration is now doing. Trump is also adding his Twitter tirades to that, but that's just the way he does it, and that may have some kind of an effect. We know that administration officials spent a good part of the week trying to put together what exactly they were going to do. They were up on Capitol Hill yesterday filling in Republicans. I saw a few of them walking around in between meetings, and by the end of the day, Republicans were pretty pleased with what we are believed to be learning more about here today. And most of these Republicans voted against the Iran nuclear deal that the previous administration had put together, but the types of actions that the president's taking today are what they want to see.
Right.
Responding in kind with American economic might, and then threatening perhaps even more if needed.
Before I let you in, Jonathan, I just want to read a quick statement from House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Ed Royce. He's a Republican from Fullerton, California. He wrote, quote, "Iran's dangerous and provocative acts are a direct threat to the United States and our allies. I'm glad the administration is taking long overdue steps to hold the regime accountable. I look forward to working with the administration to build on these designations, push back against Iran's destructive policies, and promote stability in the Middle East," unquote. That's from Congressman Ed Royce, who's a Republican from California, and he's the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Jonathan?
And we can't conflate the ballistic missile controversy with the Iran nuclear deal. The Iran nuclear deal did lift sanctions, multiple kinds of sanctions, but there was always, in fact, the deal was criticized for not including ballistic missile testing in it. It was only supposed to handle the nuclear program that Iran had, and these kinds of sanctions that the Trump administration is announcing today, these are unilateral sanctions that are not particularly effective. The very effective international sanctions that brought Iran to the table on the nuclear issue were imposed by all of the major powers. And there's a real sense in Europe that they do not want the Trump administration to mess up the Iran nuclear deal, so they are not likely to go along with these.
Let me get to a few more audience questions. Tom wrote us on Facebook with regard to this idea of extreme vetting that's been coming up in the last few weeks. Tom wrote, "Any ideas how extreme vetting differs from that which was done prior to the infamous executive order? What actually changed with this, or do we know?" Alexis?
We don't know. That's an excellent question. It's the right question to ask, because the orders that the president has put in place to put a pause on both the acceptance of refugees, the bar to Syrian refugees indefinitely, and the pause on the idea of migrants coming from predominantly 7 Muslim countries. All of those are being described at the White House as an effort to develop a vetting system that they feel more confident about. So it's actually in the order what it is. The goal is to create this system, to review it, and then put it in place. And that's what the pause is about. So it's not possible to answer the question definitively now in terms of what this administration is going to put in place. We do know what's in place now. And the argument has been that extreme vetting is in fact taking place. And it's in the holdover from the Obama administration, that it takes a very long time for these individuals to be able to come into the country. What the Trump administration is concerned about is countries where they don't think that they're getting participation from the governments to provide the kind of information about the citizens who are trying to come in. And so the argument is about whether the extreme vetting is really going to turn out to be a ban in the end anyway.
Jonathan?
I mean, I think that it's an important question because we don't know what this process is, and when the pause for these 7 majority Muslim countries comes to the end, if they haven't actually made any progress in implementing some new policy, they'll probably just extend the pause. That's the fear of immigration lawyers, is that this is an indefinite pause. It is not really time limited, because satisfying President Trump with extreme vetting might be just impossible.
And I would recommend to Tom and everyone else, to their credit, 60 Minutes had run a piece in the fall, and they reran it again this past Sunday, that looked exactly at what a Syrian refugee family would have to go through to get to the States. And they tracked a family and went and talked to the State Department officials who are over in the Middle East, who conduct the interviews, who lead these families through the review process. It's exhaustive. You've really got to want to come to this country to go through that process. And they laid it out pretty well. So I'd recommend go looking at that as a good, vivid example of the real world, steps that are taken by people.
With regards to the border wall between the U.S. and Mexico, John wrote us on Facebook, how in the world can we spend billions and billions on an incredibly stupid wall, but not find the money to make sure that the people of Flint aren't drinking poisoned water?
Well, that's the argument a lot of people make up on Capitol Hill, certainly, and I think it will be part of any big spending plan that gets put together. Flint was one of the things that slowed down consideration of a spending bill at the end of the year last year. There was some money included in there, not everything they wanted. But that's an argument, John, that a lot of Democrats certainly are making and others will make. And I think it's going to be part of the reason why this remains such a difficult thing to do, that it's going to the politics of finding $14 billion to build a wall that a lot of people who live along the border don't even want. That's going to be a tricky thing and could consume the president's time completely if he really wanted to devote himself to it.
I wonder if it's going to be that big a deal. I mean, the fact of the matter is, like, you have people like Mick Mulvaney, a congressman from South Carolina, who actually held up for days or weeks relief funding for Superstorm Sandy, because he said that any emergency funding for the storm victims needed to be offset with cuts anywhere else. He's going to be the budget director almost certainly, and I just think that basically Republicans in Congress are showing themselves to be extremely malleable on the issue of spending. I'm not sure if that wall's $14 billion is going to be that hard to come by in the end.
Go ahead, Alexa.
I just want to ask, Josh, you were talking earlier about some of the things that President Trump is eager to do, and we know, as Ed was saying, budgeting is going to be a real challenge. He has proposed a $1 trillion, that's trillion, infrastructure package, and is continuing to talk about this with great ambition. His senior advisor, Stephen Miller, was talking about it yesterday. And the idea is that he is not going to give up on that. Infrastructure being a separate question from the wall, more airports, roads, bridges, what individual communities might need. And the argument, as Ed already was foreshadowing, is where does that money come from? At the White House, they're talking about it being part of the tax reform package, trying to create a corporate tax relief kind of package and then finding offsets. And in addition to all the other things that are really important that everybody's fighting about, the Affordable Care Act or Supreme Court nominee, when they get to this spending, Ed, I'm going to want to watch Ed, how much sleep Ed is going to be getting, because it's going to be a big lift.
Poor Ed. We'll check in with you We'll
be fine.
We'll check in with you in a few months. We're running low on time for the rest of the hour, and there's a few other things I'd like to check in on, including these protests that are taking place on a number of college campuses. 11 people were arrested at NYU, police said today, after a very, very heated protest against Gavin McInnes, who's a conservative comedian who's known for using some very incendiary language. This was a day after there were destructive protests at UC Berkeley against Milo Yiannopoulos, who is a well-known far-right kind of flamethrower. Some call him an internet troll. But the fact that he was protested so roundly put him on a certain kind of a national radar and led President Trump to threaten federal funding to UC Berkeley if they couldn't seem to be a more hospitable environment for free speech. All of this is, of course, to some ironic because the free speech movement began at UC Berkeley in 1964 when Mario Savio was arrested by the police and students sat down around the police car to prevent it from moving. One of our listeners, Rick, asked on Facebook, should the mayor and chief of police be held accountable in Berkeley for allowing a protest to turn into anarchy? I'm not asking you to opine on law enforcement, but where do we go from this environment where it seems like this kind of speech is so radioactive that we can't even have the conversation?
Hey, this is what college campuses do. I'm so old that I can remember what college campuses did about free speech. So, I mean, it's what is it? What is it? This is a continuum of a long tradition at college campuses. It's just that we have social media now that bring it into our, it's into our bloodstream instantly, and it's cable television gets there rapidly and all of that. Presidents in memoriam have, had lots of anxiety. Let's look back in history. Nixon, LBJ, all of them have had major heartburn over what's happened on college campuses in the past. It's just really fascinating to see that we're 2 weeks into the new administration.
I mean, for conservatives, the cause of left-wing students shutting down conversation on campuses is a big issue. In this case, and I'm not defending the rioters, but in this case, Milo Yiannopoulos is a leader of the alt-right. He has said extremely, I would just say, racist things.
No, you can say racist. He was going to use this event to formally announce a scholarship for white men only.
Exactly. And the idea that he was at the University of California at Berkeley to announce this is an incendiary act. I'm not justifying rioting, but whoever invited Milo Yiannopoulos to Berkeley, of all places, to do this, knew what they were getting into.
Another one of our listeners, Aaron, wrote on our website, I wish you would talk about why Trump is in such a hurry to do these things. Why can't he wait for Congress, which he can assume will be cooperative, to pass laws? I remember how only 2 weeks ago governing in this way was seen by conservatives as right next to dictatorship.
See, I don't think he's rushing. I think he's just trying to do too much at once. And I think, the result of that has been the chaos and the confusion and the exhaustion that a lot of people in the Trump administration are now feeling 2 weeks in. Everything he has done so far is consistent with his campaign promises. He's, to his credit, said he was going to do things, and he's doing them. And for those that thought that we took him too literally, well, here's why. Because when somebody says they're going to do something, they often do it, and that's what he's been doing. The pacing perhaps could have been a little better. But part of the reason, too, is Congress can't get started on these things until cabinet nominees are in place and a government is filled out. And the Senate right now is so logjammed that he probably figures, well, I'm just going to keep doing what I can do with my pen, and we'll get around to tax reform and health care reform and confirming a Supreme Court justice and infrastructure by the spring once my cabinet's in place.
But the pacing is completely intentional. I mean, Steve Bannon said that he wanted to blow up Washington, and they came in with shock and awe. They came in not because he was impatient with Congress or anything. He wants this to happen. That's what Bannon loves, and they love it. Believe me, most of Trump's most ardent supporters think this is all fantastic.
Yep.
But Josh just read from the Gallup poll indicating that there are some Americans who are beginning to watch the situation after 2 weeks and asking themselves, is this substance? Is this style? Is this delivering on promises that are going to make my life better? They're all asking questions, as we are, about what's the rationale behind this? And the only thing I could add is we've never had a businessman come into the White House with no political experience, and that's fascinating to watch.
Well, I'm going to choose a little style over substance right now and try to end this hour on a slightly less fraught political note and just kind of try to get us into the weekend with something that has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with pop culture and fun. Yes, Beyonce.
Very important.
Absolutely. And
Wins.
Yeah, that's right. She wins every time. And now she can add another jewel to her crown. She is now the queen of Instagram. On Wednesday, she posted an artful picture of herself with a visible baby bump and announced that she's expecting twins. She already has one daughter with her husband, the rap mogul Jay-Z. Soon afterward, the Guinness World Records announced that post broke the record for the most likes on Instagram. Currently, it has more than 9.2 million likes and more than 430,000 comments. Now, I know social media might seem like a triviality, but consider that Snapchat, a social network popular with young adults, is about to go public. They announced it this week. Snapchat says in its documents with the SEC that in just 2 years, it has built an advertising business worth more than $400 million. It's great to be Beyonce.
And to be Snapchat.
And to be Snapchat, exactly. And Mark Zuckerberg had tried to buy Snapchat at one point, and they said no. They knew that they had the value for it.
They've got the kids on their side. That's why.
They absolutely have the kids on their side. Well, we were glad to have you on our side, Ed O'Keefe, congressional correspondent for The Washington Post. Thank you, Ed.
Great to be with you.
Alexis Simendinger, White House correspondent for Real Clear Politics. Alexis, thank you.
A pleasure.
And Jonathan Wiseman, deputy Washington editor for The New York Times and the author of the novel Number 4 Imperial Lane. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Until next time, Joshua.
Remember that you can subscribe to 1A's podcast on iTunes or whatever app you like. We'd love it if you'd write us a review, and we'd love you even more if you'd share it with your friends. We've been at this for about a month. Thank you so very much for helping to keep 1A rising in the podcast listings, and you'll find even more great podcasts online at npr.org/podcasts. 1A comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for listening. This is 1A.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Cancer Treatment Centers of America, offering immunotherapy and other personalized treatment options to address patients' individual needs. More about precision cancer treatment at cancercenter.com. From Blue Vine, offering businesses revolving lines of credit to cover expenses, make payroll, purchase supplies, and to expand. Credit lines up to $100,000. Learn more at bluevine.com. And from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation at gatesfoundation.org.
After the election, are you fired up or burned out? Some of you told us a bit of both.
I feel a little fatigued, but I also feel very empowered with everything that's been going on.
I'm Joshua Johnson. Next time on 1A, we'll take your calls on what this moment means for you and for America. Do you feel like tuning out to save your sanity, or is this a moment you are determined not to miss? Violence in Canada exposes the racist underbelly of a proudly diverse nation. And what exactly did happen with that phone call to Australia? We'd love to hear your questions and stories about this week's international news. Email us 1a@wamu.org, comment on our Facebook page, or tweet us at 1a. This is 1A. I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for checking us out today. It's time for our weekly trip around the world in the global edition of the Friday News Roundup.
When you hear about the tough phone calls I'm having, don't worry about it.
I appreciate your interest.
Just don't worry about it.
It's better that these conversations are conducted candidly.
We have to be tough. It's time we're going to be a little tough, folks.
Frankly, privately.
We're taken advantage of by every nation in the world virtually.
If you'll see reports of them, I'm not going to add to them.
The White House placed a number of calls this week, including one to Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. Reportedly, it did not go well. Australia is just one of several nations the new administration has been having some tough dealings with, including North Korea, Mexico, and Iran, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Joining me in studio for the conversation are Shane Harris, senior writer at the Wall Street Journal, and the author of At War, The Rise of the Military Internet Complex. Shane Harris, welcome to 1A.
Thanks, Josh.
Karin Demerjian is a reporter for The Washington Post. Karin, glad to have you here.
Good to be here.
And we're joined by NPR's Pentagon correspondent, Tom Bowman. Welcome, Tom.
Good to be here.
Please do send us your questions and stories about the week's international news. Email us, 1a@wamu.org. Comment on our Facebook page. Tweet us at 1a. And if you've ever wondered what Tom Bowman looks like, you can see him on our video stream. Online at the1a.org. That's the word the number one, the letter A. .org. Let's begin with what, as we speak right now, is breaking news about sanctions against Iran. The latest that we've heard is that the Trump administration today imposed sanctions on 13 people and 12 companies in response to Iran's recent ballistic missile tests. Michael Flynn had said earlier this week that Iran was on notice, and perhaps now we're beginning to get a sense of what on notice means. Now, this is very early as of the moment that we are recording this, but I wonder what your early read is on what this might mean going forward. Shane Harris?
Yeah, well, we were just talking actually before the show that this doesn't look too out of line with what the Obama administration had done before in terms of imposing sanctions after ballistic missile tests. The Iranians have said that these tests were allowed and not covered by the nuclear deal. We obviously have a different view on the kind of behavior that we want to allow. So you did see this happen pretty quickly. I mean, Michael Flynn came out this week, the national security advisor, said Iran is on notice. A lot of people said, what does that mean exactly? Iran knows it's on notice for a lot of bad behavior, and now this is sort of maybe the first salvo in it. But this doesn't seem all that out of line with past practice when Iran kind of steps over the line.
A little more detail before you jump in, Tom. We're also learning that the companies targeted, that those who are targeted by the Treasury Department's action include various agencies, companies, and associates involved in procuring ballistic missile technology for Iran. There are Iranians, Lebanese, Chinese, and Emirati individuals and companies who are also blacklisted from doing any business in the U.S. or with American citizens. That's from the Associated Press. Tom Bowman?
Right. And, it's unilateral sanctions, which are never really effective. You have to have widespread sanctions, bringing in other countries to really have an impact. It sounds like it's a shot across the bow. It's, going along the lines with what Mike Flynn, the national security advisor, said. Basically, you're on notice. We're going to keep an eye on what you're doing. And part of this is the concern about Iran that we heard during the campaign from President Trump and from people like Mike Flynn. They're worried about Iran. They're worried about the proxies of Iran in that region. They're worried about Yemen in particular. They're worried about the Iranian support for the Houthi rebels. They're very worried about that waterway. Yemen is right up against going into the Red Sea onto the Suez Canal. That's a great concern for them about the shipping going through there, about possible attacks on U.S. ships as well. So that's something that you're seeing them focus much more on and will in the coming weeks and months.
Karin Demerjian?
I was just going to add that you also have to kind of put this in the context of the first 2 weeks of the Trump presidency, which is that in foreign policy in general, they're getting a lot of criticism from members of their own party for the way they handled the ban on refugees and travelers are coming to the States, for the things they've been saying about Russia even before he came into the White House. And this is a big unifying moment for the GOP. They're really happy that they're talking tough. And Trump made Iran such a centerpiece of things that he said he would do differently that he had to come out early. And he's getting a lot of support now from his people who were being pretty critical the last 2 weeks, and that had to happen for him to kind of move forward in this realm.
Again, I know it's early goings yet, and I don't want to ask you to try to foretell the future, but we have begun getting a few questions about these Iran sanctions, which were just announced. Dr. John in Pittsburgh emailed us, the Trump administration advances new sanctions from Iran after they tested a missile. Is the Trump administration going to impose even stronger sanctions on Russia and Putin, given that real bombs are dropping on the people of the Ukraine? Do you think that this is a signal of a wider attitude toward issuing sanctions, or is this really just a narrowly tailored thing?
Oh, this is tailored toward Iran in particular. They're reaching out to Russia, obviously. The president has talked about Putin being a strong leader. They hope for a better relationship. Look for them to come up with some sort of an agreement or workable plan with Russia against ISIS in Syria. So, if anything, they're going to get closer to Russia, let alone have any kind of sanctions.
Although we did have that strange episode yesterday where the UN ambassador Nikki Haley talked openly in the UN about Russia's actions in Ukraine and sort of saying we don't approve of this and there may be consequences
What happened?
for that. Well, there's been a flare-up of fighting between Ukrainian government forces and Russian-backed rebels in the eastern part of Ukraine, and you might read that as perhaps Russia deciding that maybe it can go now further because it has a more compliant or willing U.S. administration to deal with. But the Trump administration said, hold on there just a second. I mean, we oppose this kind of behavior and there may be consequences for it, which seemed to take a lot of people by surprise because it was taking a tougher line with Russia than we'd seen before.
Yeah, and nobody's quite sure exactly what the motivation is, if this is just trying to make sure that Russia trying to make sure that Ukraine stays unstable, or if this is actually a new venture. That the fighting is taking place in the area around Avdiivka, which is a pretty well-traversed territory in this fight. It's just that the intensity isn't like anything that we've seen since I think it was February 2015, the last time it was quite this intense in an area that's very close by to where they're fighting right now.
In one last thing, it could be in some ways putting Russia on notice without saying so, that, listen, we're keeping an eye on Ukraine. Don't try anything. Don't move farther into the country. Don't try to destabilize this country even more. We're not going to accept that.
That seems to be one of those issues that, and you have a better scope on this than I do, but I saw a little clip of an interview that CNN's Christiane Amanpour did yesterday with Marine Le Pen, one of the candidates to be the next president of France, who's a very far right candidate. And she was asking, Ms. Amanpour was asking Ms. Le Pen about her views on Russia and this whole piece of geopolitics. It's kind of, it almost felt like a litmus test. Like, where is your head at right now with regards to all of this, and what does that say to us about who you are?
Well, France and Russia, and Le Pen specifically, is a totally other thing, because I think her party took money from a Russian bank at one point to keep themselves afloat. So that we almost know what that connection is, and in much more concrete terms, I think, than here. But I think that Shane's point that this came up at the UN is remarkable, just because you've had such softer talk about Russia. You have the representatives of the Trump administration not commit ever to saying we're going to do more sanctions, to say, oh, we won't dismantle sanctions that exist right now, but we'll look at them in the future, right? So I don't think it would be a very, very big shift to have the what Nikki Haley said shift into you're on notice and we're going to put sanctions down on you. It's almost like that's coming from the much softer end, whereas Iran, you could have assumed that them saying on notice with Iran, given everything Trump said in the campaign, was going to be something much, much more severe than sanctions. But sanctions is kind of like the safe middle ground for everybody on that. It's not bloody. It's, It
doesn't require boots on the ground.
No, and it doesn't even require an act of Congress yet to do this sort of stuff. I mean, that would be much more severe sanctions. That would be a big change. But this is kind of a clean way of being like, okay, we're being tough. And the fact that you don't really have that, you don't need that to be backing up the Russia gesture for that to be notable.
It's the Friday Global edition of the Friday News Roundup with Karin Demerjen of the Washington Post, Tom Bowman of NPR, Shane Harris of the Wall Street Journal, and with you. We'd love to know your questions, thoughts, stories about the week's international news. Comment on our Facebook page, tweet us at 1A, or email 1A@WAMU.org. Let's walk back to Iran for 1 second. What's the response been like from Iran? After Michael Flynn said Iran is on notice, Iran reacted. What was that like, and what impact has that had?
Well, I
Shane?
mean, one way to read this is that there was a statement coming out of the Supreme Leader's spokesperson who said, something to the effect of, we're used to uninformed administrations talking big and puffing up. I mean, didn't say puffing up, but essentially saying, look, we see you over there saying we're on notice. Woo, what does that mean? And basically, I think they're signaling to the United States as well, look, if you're going to come out here with these threats, they better not be empty. And you saw many foreign policy experts echoing that if you're going to come out as the national security advisor from the podium at the White House and make these, gestures towards Iran, there better be something to back it up. So I'm not sure that they were, terribly moved by that or particularly put off. And as far as being on notice, as we said, I mean, they're used to a tense relationship with the United States. That's not new.
Tom?
In one thing that's going to be interesting to watch in the coming months is whether the Iranian Revolutionary Guard send their fast boats out into the Gulf and, kind of swirl around U.S. ships or other ships. And if they do, what would be the response from this administration? The president said that, military action is not off the table. Will they be much more aggressive? I think he said during the campaign that he would have shot up some of these Iranian boats had he been in office. So that's something to keep an eye on. What do the Revolutionary Guards do in this situation? Do they become more emboldened, or are they going to hold back because of this new president?
Before we hit a break, Tom, you had mentioned about unilateral sanctions in the past and that they're not terribly effective. Can you give me like the 30-second explanation of what she meant by that?
Well, you need everyone on board to have sanctions that are really going to stick. You can't just have one country, the United States, doing it. It's not that effective. What was effective against Iran is when the entire world most of the world joined in on sanctions against Iran that put great pressure on them that resulted in this nuclear deal. Some would disagree with that, but clearly a huge number of countries on board with sanctions has an impact.
We'll continue with this conversation on the other side of the break with NPR's Tom Bowman, Karin DeMergen of The Washington Post, and Shane Harris of The Wall Street Journal. Plenty to talk about: the travel ban, the attack at the Louvre, violence in Canada, that phone call with Australia. We'd love to continue this conversation, and let us know what you would like us to talk about. We'll get to more of it as the hour goes on. I'm Joshua Johnson. Glad to be with you. You're listening to 1A from WAMU and NPR.
And from Baird, providing global financial resources and market expertise to clients the world over. rwbaird.com has more information. From Fidelity, offering wealth planning using a personal, dedicated relationship to help clients build, manage, and preserve their family's wealth. Learn more at fidelity.com/wealth. Fidelity Brokerage Services. And from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation at macfound.org.
This is 1A. I'm Joshua Johnson. Our Friday News Roundup continues with Shane Harris of The Wall Street Journal, Karin DeMergen of The Washington Post, and Tom Bowman of NPR. We welcome your questions and thoughts about the week's international news. Tweet us at 1A, comment on our Facebook page, or email 1A@wamu.org. And you can watch the live video stream of this hour on our website, the1a.org. That's the word the number 1, the letter A.org. Let's talk about the continuing fallout from the travel ban from the Trump administration. There's been a lot of controversy and a tremendous amount of protests after the president temporarily banned entry from people from 7 Muslim-majority nations, put a complete stop on Syrian refugees. How is this decision being received around the world going forward? What do we make of the response around the world? Retaliation, reaction, where does that stand right now?
Well, I think it seems you can kind of look at this, I think, in kind of 2 lanes. One is the objection to the policy, which, of course, as you said, has ignited protests here. It's ignited protests and official protests from other countries around the world. We've seen the Iraqis saying they're going to review the immigration restrictions coming into their country. I think that was all pretty predictable. And then I think domestically, politically, there's been a real reaction to how this order was rolled out. And what we know now is that it was put together quite hastily. The individual agencies and departments in the U.S. government that actually have to enforce this at the hundreds of ports of entry that we have were only told about it, I think, in the hours before it was supposed to go into effect. I think what that's probably caused for a lot of congressional Republicans is kind of shaking their confidence a bit in, whether or not this administration is really equipped to govern. Because if you're going to issue a huge policy like this affecting immigration and travel from 7 countries, you really just can't do it shooting from the hip. It can't be done on the fly. And this has raised a lot of questions about how policy is being made by the White House and how it's being implemented.
Tom?
This raised questions across the board, from Capitol Hill to the agencies to the Pentagon to foreign capitals. The Iraqi foreign minister came out against this. I saw one story from CBS News. They were talking with an Iraqi general working with the U.S. against ISIS who couldn't get a visa to the United States. So you have to look at issues like that. It just doesn't make sense. I understand that Mike Pence has met with senators, Republican senators on the Hill, and basically said, we'll do better. I think everyone's admitting now that they threw this out there. Nobody understood it, how it worked, starting with those in customs. Would green card holders get in? It was utter confusion. And I think people are still trying to unpack this and understand exactly what it means.
Karin?
And I think the thing that really, really broke a lot of Republicans on this is the fact that there were so many green card holders that were swept up in it. Because, this is, Republicans were advocating for moratoriums, at least temporarily, on Syrian and Iraqi refugees for a long time. Some of these things I think they probably could have swallowed as a party, but the green card holders that just happened to be from those places, they really couldn't. And now there's been corrections issued. I think that the DHS secretary has said, okay, basically that's not going to happen anymore for green card holders except for in certain circumstances where, you still technically need a waiver, but you'll get them to come back into the States. But that's been a thing that, the haphazardness and the mixed messages depending on whether it's a cabinet secretary talking or one of Trump's close advisors talking and whose word actually dictates what the substance of the printed order means. It has been very, very hard to parse out.
It's also forced the Pentagon to come up with a list of the Iraqi translators that worked with the U.S. soldiers, risked their lives, and the Pentagon will give that list over so these folks can try to get into the United States and not be barred from the United States.
The administration has gone to some pains to say over and over to the U.S. and to the world, this is not a Muslim ban. There are more than 40 other nations on the planet that are majority Muslim that are not covered by this measure. If we wanted to ban Muslims, we would have done it outright, and we would have made it a much larger order. But that's illegal. That's not the policy of the U.S. government, and we are trying to do this in a very targeted and a very thoughtful way. How is that playing around the world?
Well, I don't think people are buying it. These are a Muslim majority country. That's clearly the reason that they did this. It's not because they're from a particular region. It has to do with the Muslims. Clearly, there's absolutely no question about it. And the other question is, they start out in their executive order talking about 9/11 and talking about how 19 individuals came to this country and killed 3,000 Americans. Most of those people were from Saudi Arabia. Saudi is not on the list. The UAE is not on the list. Pakistan is not on the list. They've never explained that adequately.
Not one country that are covered on this list has ever sent an emigre to the United States who committed an act of terrorism. Not one.
Right.
And I believe that the Cato Institute put out a study that said that the odds of an American being killed in a terror attack at all in the last 40 years are 1 in about 2.5 million. And the odds of being killed by a refugee are 1 in 3.6 billion. So it seems like the odds of this are rather infinitesimal.
Sure, I'm sure it's much more dangerous to be in a car accident, that your chances of that. But the other thing, just as far as the Muslim ban goes, I think the thing that set a lot of people off is that there is an exemption for religious minorities. And when you're talking about Muslim majority countries, minus the religious minorities, that equals the Muslims from these countries. There's no way around that math. And it doesn't include Saudi, it doesn't include Pakistan, but we're afraid not to sell F-16s to Pakistan, and Saudi is an ally, right? And so there's all kinds of reasons, and many Republicans also pointed to the 7 countries as a list that Obama put, as countries Obama put on a list of countries of concern as a way of excusing that. But it does still boil down to, in these very high-profile Muslim nations of the Middle East, it's really mostly just the Muslims.
And
that
even
have
that
been
list
targeted.
of the so-called countries of concern was after much wrangling with congressional Republicans who were pushing to get those on the list. And there's been some reports that, well, the Obama administration banned travel temporarily from Iraq. That's not true either. There was a 6-month period of higher scrutiny that was placed on this. Look, we can also go back and see an interview that Rudy Giuliani, an advisor to President Trump, gave recently, in which he essentially said, yes, this is a Muslim ban, and we wanted to look for a way to do this and have it be legal, because banning people from all Muslim countries wouldn't be legal. Even the president is calling it a ban and said in the campaign that he wanted to put a halt to Muslim immigration. So it should not be surprising at all to the White House that that is how this is being read domestically and abroad.
Tom?
And the other thing, this plays right into the hands of ISIS. And I'm not just saying that, but retired generals, members of Congress are saying this, that this is the narrative that ISIS wants, that you people are against the Muslim world. You don't want Muslims. And they can point to the citizens now in Iraq, for example, and say, see, we've told you all along, they don't want you in their country.
And what
we were right.
And what about this aspect of the refugee ban? Is that having a particular resonance around the world?
I mean, it's making us look rather heartless in a lot of places, because it's not even just the refugees from Syria, who it feels terrible to put them in a separate category because they're going through some of the worst fighting in the whole world, right? But this is all refugees for a while. We're looking at anybody from any place in the world that's trying to flee something that's being persecuted for something, with very few exceptions.
And look at the scrutiny now on refugees. It's 1.5 to 2 years to get into this country.
Yeah. It's
so it's not
vetting,
like
actually.
it's not like you just hop a flight and get into the United States.
Right.
I mean, I think that's lost on a lot of people that are reading and hearing about this.
Well, one nation that has been touting its openness to refugees is Canada. It has welcomed thousands of refugees from war seeking a haven. But on Sunday, that was upended when a man walked into a mosque and killed 6 people, wounded 8 others. The shooter, Alexandre Bissonnette, was charged with 6 counts of murder. Let's get the latest on that and what it might say about Canada these days from Catherine Cullen. She is a senior reporter for CBC News based in Ottawa. She spent many years in Quebec and was in Quebec City to cover the mosque shooting. Catherine Cullen, welcome to 1A.
Hello.
Where does the investigation stand right now?
Well, as you say, the shooter has been charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, also 5 counts of attempted murder with a restricted weapon, because in addition to the 6 people that were killed, 19 others were injured, 5 of them critically. So he is, of course, still in custody at this point. And obviously people are asking a lot of questions about what could drive somebody to do something like this. Certainly journalists like myself, my colleagues, have been digging around trying to find out a little bit more about Alexandre Bissonnette. We know that he is 27 years old, a university student in Quebec City. That's where he grew up. We're hearing more and more about his political views. One organizer of a political discussion group in the area said that Bissonnette did come in and join them. They were a conservative discussion group, but that his views were perhaps a little bit too radical for them. They associated him with a term that I know is being discussed very much in the United States and here in Canada, this idea of the alt-right, that he was somebody who had expressed admiration for the far-right French politician Marianne Le Pen. He liked Donald Trump a lot, too, from what we're told. But, at this point, obviously, still a lot of questions.
There's been a fair amount of reporting in the last few days about this kind of racist underbelly that's small but ardent that exists in Canada, particularly in parts of Quebec, that is very xenophobic. How do you see that underbelly kind of manifesting? Is this coming to a head more with more refugees coming in, or is this just kind of a small fringe that occasionally rises up?
It's a very complicated question, I would say, within Canada and within Quebec particularly. Here in Canada, we often talk about this idea of, and maybe it's almost become a little bit of a cliche, but of there being 2 solitudes in Canada. Quebec, obviously much more influenced by what's going on in France than the rest of Canada. The discussion there, and as you mentioned when you introduced me, I did live in Quebec for many years, the discussion there about how we deal with issues of religious difference. Cultural accommodation is a term that gets used a lot in Quebec. That discussion is very different than the discussion happening in the rest of Canada. It looks a bit more like the discussion that's been going on in France. So even beyond these far-right groups, and some of my colleagues have done some excellent work establishing their existence in Quebec. And I think I should say as well that we don't know enough about Alexandre Bissonnette yet, the suspect in all of this. We haven't associated him particularly with any of those far-right groups in Quebec. But there has been a broader discussion about what kind of religious where people can wear in public, the use of overt religious symbols. It's been going on for decades in Quebec. And this shooting this past weekend really, I think, has caused a lot of people to stop and reflect about the tone that discussion has taken. Sometimes we've seen both the premier of the province of Quebec, so the equivalent of the governor, as well as his political opposition, saying we need to understand that words matter, and we need to think about some of the things that we're saying in these discussions.
Yeah, I understand Quebec's Premier Philippe Bouillard has been rather outspoken on this, as has Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. What has the Prime Minister been saying?
Now, Justin Trudeau's message from the time that he got into office has been about our diversity being our strength. Both Premier Philippe Couillard and Justin Trudeau have been very quick to condemn this. In fact, the shooting happened at 8 o'clock at night. As you know, it takes some time for news of all of this to spread. The Premier held a news conference at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he said, not just to Quebecers, not just to Canadians, but to Quebec Muslims, vous êtes chez vous ici. You are home. And we want you to understand that we are mourning with you. The message from the Prime Minister has been very similar. He stood up in Canada's Parliament in the House of Commons later that day, and he said, 36 million hearts are breaking. That's the population of Canada. We understand that these men were fathers like us. Muslims are contributors to Canadian society. You are part of our country, and anyone who seeks to sow division and fear will not do so. A real message of unity coming from all the political leaders in Canada, although I will note that Philippe Couillard in particular said it's very easy to talk about unity right now. A terrible thing has happened. The question is, where does this discussion go 2 weeks from now and beyond?
What is your sense, before I let you go, what is your sense of where this goes 2 weeks and beyond? Are Canadians beginning to mobilize and speak out, or is this just the kind of thing that happens? It might just go in the history books.
Yeah, I hope it's not the kind of thing that happens. And I have to be honest and say I've been thinking a lot about that myself, because I spent a couple days right outside that mosque reporting on it, and saw some beautiful outpourings of support. The vigil the night after the shooting that was held in Quebec City. And there were vigils across Canada, even in the far north, in the freezing cold, in places like Iqaluit, where there is, not a lot of people, let alone a big Muslim community. People came out. In Quebec City itself, thousands of people. I couldn't believe it. Just thousands of people in the streets. They brought signs. They said, Islamophobia is not a Quebec value. We are with you, Muslims. Nonetheless, despite the fact that was really a beautiful moment, the degree to which this has really deeply affected Canadians, I have to admit I'm still asking myself about that. And certainly political leaders are suggesting there ought to be a change, that Philippe Couillard, the Quebec Premier in particular, has been vocal about that. But I think we're going to have to watch and see where the discussion goes from here.
Catherine Cullen is a senior reporter for CBC News based in Ottawa. Catherine, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you.
Let's continue our conversation now on the Global Friday News Roundup with Shane Harris of the Wall Street Journal, Karin Demerjen of the Washington Post, and NPR's Tom Bowman. We welcome more of your questions and thoughts about the week's international news. 1A@WAMU.org. Tweet us at 1A or comment on our Facebook page. Let's get to a few questions from our audience. Quite a few people are asking about Russia. Margaret in Santa Monica, California asks, is it true that the move to tweak Russian sanctions now permits U.S. companies to sell Russia encryption equipment? Is that true, Shane?
Technically, yes, but it should not be being read, sanctions experts are saying, as some kind of lifting of sanctions. Think of this as a fairly technical adjustment that was made to allow certain companies to sell into Russia. This is not really, shouldn't be viewed as Donald Trump came in and started loosening sanctions on Russia. This was a fairly minor kind of procedural tweak. That said, the optics of this were awful. At a time when a new president is coming in and is perceived as being overly and mysteriously sympathetic to Russia in ways that previous administrations for decades have not been, to have the Treasury Department issuing a sanctions relief looked like he was doing them a favor.
And on top of that, regarding the optics, Robin notes the loosening of the sanctions on Russia regarding cybersecurity happened at almost the same moment that Nikki Haley was criticizing Russia. Look at what they do, not what they say.
Yeah, the optics of that were disjointed, to say the least.
It's certainly, although it may have been very strategic then to say that, okay, we're trying to be tough on Russia on one side, and then also if it's a technical correction that has to happen, and this is the thing, when you're talking about governments that do have to deal with each other, even though they're enemies, we can't have zero ties to Russia. We can't have zero intelligence sharing. And frankly, it's probably I'm not an expert on this, but I'm assuming it's better if we're selling them encryption equipment than using theirs. You know?
And I think this exactly. And it's just seen as like trying to help American companies. You can pitch it that way, too.
So you're not going to have an absolute zero-sum balance on these sorts of dealings, and you have to know that. But yes, it's weird, and it seems contradictory to have it happen exactly with no explanation as well.
And selling through the FSB, which is one of the agencies that was hacking around the U.S. election. So,
Lisa tweeted, please address the story behind and legality of Trump's office turning off a recording device during the phone call with Putin. Betty from Silver Spring, Maryland asks, what does this mean for transparency? Before we hit a break, had you heard anything about that? Is that even?
I've heard nothing about that.
No, although I will say that the readout, it's called White House puts out what's called a readout after a phone call with a foreign leader, where they kind of give a summary of it, was pretty spare, I think, on the one that they put out for Putin, and we still don't know a lot of details about that. Not necessarily unusual. Lots of administrations are selective about what they say and what they don't say, but I had not heard anything about the recording being off.
How much more do we think, before we hit a break, this U.S.-Russia relationship? I know that there are a lot of people in the U.S. who are looking at this clearly with a lot of skepticism, as are our listeners. What about the rest of the world? How has the rest of the world's view of U.S.-Russia been shifting in the last week, before we hit a break?
Oh, my goodness. I think everybody is watching, especially in Europe, because everybody in Europe is in such a tenuous time right now where they don't quite know where they're going in terms of their cohesion. And a lot of it matters just because Russia and the United States are the push and pull, right? Russia kind of wins if they break up United States and the EU, if NATO goes away. And so definitely in Eastern Europe, a lot of countries are watching that very, very closely and seeing what kind of moves the U.S. will or won't make to support countries like Ukraine, like the border countries of the NATO border countries and the Baltics and places like that. There's all kinds of flashpoints.
In the Baltic states in particular,
very
hard up against Russia, and also the issue of more U.S. troops heading into Europe. They would like to see those continue.
Let's continue this conversation on the other side of this break. Stay close. Are diving in and getting involved to oppose or support the changes in Washington and elsewhere. A lot of people are burned out and want nothing to do with politics or activism right now. And some folks are just exhausted, probably on both sides. What about you? How are you doing? Leave us a voicemail 855-236-1A1A. Does this moment in America and the world have you feeling fired up or burned out? And how are you handling it? Tell us your story. 855-236-1A1A. That's 855-236-1212. You can also make a voice memo with your smartphone and email it to 1A@WAMU.org. We'll play some of your stories next week on 1A. Back to the Friday News Roundup now with NPR's Tom Bowman, Karin Demerjen of The Washington Post, and Shane Harris of The Wall Street Journal. Several listeners have been messaging us asking about Yemen, the raid that took place this week. Tom Bowman, what happened in this raid?
Well, what happened was Navy SEALs went into this area in Yemen after a supposed al-Qaeda location. It was a series of houses or a compound, and quickly ran into trouble. There was a great firefight there. They had to bring in some Cobra gunships. And locals tell NPR, our reporter Alice Fordham reached out to some people, that 24 civilians were killed in this raid, including 9 children. Now, the U.S. military says 14 al-Qaeda fighters were killed. We believe there were civilian non-combatants killed as well, and we're looking into that. But clearly, a lot of questions are being raised about what happened here. Did they know there were families at this location? Were they surprised? There are some reports that they were surprised. They lost the element of surprise. So should they have scrubbed the mission? Our reporter, Alice Fordham, talking to locals, said no, they were not. They were the ones who were surprised by this raid. They saw the SEALs walking toward the compound and asked what they were doing, and then one of these guys was shot, and then the gunfire erupted. The Pentagon says they did collect some valuable information that could be used against, al-Qaeda in Yemen for further operations. But again, a lot of questions are being raised about exactly what happened here.
Remind us why this is going on. Why Yemen? Why now? What's underneath all of this? Shane?
Right. So Yemen is the home to, as we call it, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which has for more than a decade been one of the primary al-Qaeda affiliates that the U.S. has been battling. They're particularly adept at building very sophisticated explosives, which can bypass airplane security, and have kind of had the resident bomb-making expertise of the al-Qaeda groups, if you like. So it's been something that's been very much on the radar of U.S. intelligence and military agencies. This raid was essentially to go in and, as Tom was saying, get information and what they thought was valuable intelligence. And when something like that happens, you decide to go in and get the information rather than just take out the compound, because what's on the ground is so valuable that you can't afford to just destroy all of it. Now that the questions that are being asked really here too are, what was the planning like up to this raid? White House spokesperson Sean Spicer seemed to indicate that this raid was actually approved by the Obama administration before they left. Former Obama administration officials are now coming out and saying, no, there was no thumbs up or thumbs down. This was your guys' call. Yes, it was prepared and everything was ready to go, but it was ultimately Donald Trump's call to launch that raid. Tom?
And what the Obama administration officials are saying is this particular raid was never approved, that they talked about the threat of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in general, and then they passed this off to the Trump administration. So there's going to be a lot of talk about this and try to figure out exactly what happened and who approved what and who said what in the coming days. But that's very serious, because Sean Spicer said from the podium that this was approved by Obama administration officials. They say that did not happen.
Right.
And put this in some context in terms, I know that there were a number of things that seemed to have gone wrong in this raid. But I imagine that raids like this are inherently complex, and that I wonder from your experience, is this the kind of thing, are these the kinds of complications from this raid that just happen in raids like this, or is this unusual in terms of the things that went wrong?
This seems to be unusual. The civilian death toll, if it is true, if it were 24 civilians killed, as the locals say, the Pentagon is saying, we believe there were women and maybe children killed. That is unusual, because what is the intelligence as you go in? You're watching this with satellites, your other intelligence means. What are you picking up? What's they call the pattern of life? What are you seeing here? If you see a lot of women and children running around, do you say, well, hang on a second, should we wait until some of these adult males leave? How should we handle this? So there's going to be a lot of questions about that, again, in the coming days and weeks. Should you have mounted this raid knowing there'd be a civilian death toll like this? And as Secretary Rumsfeld said once many years ago, are you creating more terrorists than you're killing?
Carmen?
And I would just add, I think there was also the insinuation that the secrecy of the mission may have been compromised before they actually went, which is problematic. But just from an optics standpoint, presidencies can be made or kind of tarnished dramatically by moments like this. Obama campaigned for years off of the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, right? They got so much mileage. They may have gotten a re-election out of that, frankly. There was so much support because that went well. And this is Trump's opening salvo, basically, on how he's going to be the tough, president that actually cleans this up. And he gets a Navy SEAL killed. It doesn't look good. And even if it's not necessarily entirely his fault, it just doesn't look good when you're talking about the comparison. And that's why you have this wild finger pointing back and forth. And, and now it's difficult to know who to believe because Spicer's standing up there and, putting dates and listing things out and saying they were waiting for a moonless night and all this stuff. But you know what? A week ago, he was lying about crowd sizes. So we don't know whether we take him at his word.
I wonder, though, if part of the response from the Trump administration or from President Trump supporters would be, well, if Congress had moved some of our nominees along, if we hadn't had to fight so hard for some of our people to get in place, if the transition had been a little easier, maybe, just maybe, this would have been a smoother process and we would have had a better implementation of essential operations like this to make good on our campaign promises.
You can't really make that argument here because they got their national security team fast. They had their national security team the first day. They had the DHS secretary and the defense secretary. You didn't need Tillerson to make this operation run. And you even got him a few days later.
Yeah, that's not an issue in this because you have military people who have been planning this really since they say early November. So it's not an issue of having certain civilians in the right places. This is an issue of, did you do enough planning for this mission? Were there is an intelligence breakdown? Did you realize what you were going into? But you're right, these are very, very complex operations. I've been on many patrols with special forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you walk into a village, sometimes you don't know what you're going to come up against. And these guys are on the ground, on foot. If something bad happens, if they're taking fire, and in this case, the Pentagon says, some of the women killed actually picked up weapons from their dead husbands or whatever, comrades, and started firing against the Americans. So you are no longer a civilian. You're now a combatant. But it seems to have gone beyond that and killing children and other women as well.
Since you've been on a number of these missions, add a little more context for us in terms of how these missions work. If I'm part of a team that's deployed for a mission like what happened in Yemen this week, and something goes sideways, how much of that is part of my planning for, in terms of contingencies? If this happens, do that. If this happens, do this other thing. If it all goes crazy, radio us, we'll get you out of here. And how much of it is just up to the soldiers to improvise, to figure it out?
Well, and something like this is a huge amount of the planning that goes on. This is Navy SEAL Team 6. So you may build a mock-up of this village. You'll be training for weeks, sometimes months. You'll know exactly which building is where are the open doors and the windows and entrances and so forth. A huge amount of planning. And clearly, in the case of you can pull back, if you can pull away, you will. But sometimes you can't. Sometimes you're in the middle of a firefight, and along could be an AC-130 gunship. It could be Cobra helicopters. They're going to come to your rescue. You're under fire, and they have to save you. And sometimes in a situation like that, the wrong people get killed. These are very, very difficult operations. But again, this death toll, if this is true, if you have this many civilians dead, that's not supposed to happen.
I wonder if maybe there's another perspective to take on this compared to what the Obama administration did. Mike tweeted us, Joshua, more extreme hypocrisy. Obama killed hundreds of civilians in drone raids, and the media hushed it up.
Yeah, this is a very important point to make in this particular raid as well, because purportedly one of the little girls who was killed was the daughter of Anwar al-Awlaki, who many people will remember was an American citizen, a cleric who was killed in a drone strike authorized by Barack Obama. And sometime after that, his son was killed as so-called collateral damage in a drone strike that was not targeting him. But this reminds people that absolutely the United States has been responsible for many of these strikes strikes that have killed innocent people and non-combatants as well. And the particular aspect of now 2 of al-Awlaki's children having been killed. She was an American citizen too, by the way, this little 8-year-old girl. That absolutely is part of this narrative and is not going to be missed around the world.
And also, I would push back on that a bit. I mean, the media has done a lot of stories about drone strikes under the Obama administration. Obama has approved far more drone strikes than George W. Bush has. There have been a lot of civilians killed in these. But that's one of the challenges here. If you believe there's, some bad guys, some terrorists in this location, there could be civilians there, they could be planning an attack, what do you do? Do you fire a drone off, or do you send the Navy SEAL team in and risk their lives? These are very difficult issues. But he's absolutely right. A lot of civilians have been killed in drone strikes with the Obama administration.
2 more things I'd like to get into before we have to end this hour. Let's go back to Ukraine for just a second. I know a number of listeners wanted us to talk about it a little further, and I believe we touched on this, but I want to make sure we don't miss it. What's the big picture concern here with Ukraine? What's the geopolitical issue in terms of why the U.S. is so invested in this, and what's going on the ground there?
Well, Ukraine has been the epicenter of a fight right now that the small picture, right, is that the Ukrainian government and its army is fighting against a bunch of separatists who have the backing of Russia in the east. It's a separatist movement. Russia keeps coming in and going out with its tanks whenever it wants to, saying it's not really involved, saying every Russian soldier that shows up there is just a volunteer. It's not actually an official mission. But the United States doesn't believe that. We have sanctioned Russia over what was first the annexation of Crimea and then over their involvement and stirring the pot basically in eastern Ukraine, which has ebbed and flowed over the last few years. There's been peace agreements signed that the sides have not necessarily acknowledged. And we have said, Russia, we won't lift the sanctions on you until that's gone. That's the technical stuff that's happening on the ground. The bigger picture, though, is really the question is how much is the United States going to back up these nations that it doesn't necessarily have a treaty obligation to back up because Ukraine is not part of NATO, but Ukraine wants to be part of NATO, right? And it borders NATO states. And when we're talking about countries that are in this sort of buffer area who've declared their democratic Western ambitions, do we leave them hanging them out to dry because Russia doesn't really want the West to encroach that close to its border, or do we not? And so these end up being pieces that are kind of like in the greater game of what the U.S. and Russia's relationship is going to be like. Do smaller nations like Ukraine end up getting sacrificed to this? When they feel like, okay, look, we played ball with the West after the Soviet Union broke up. We gave away all of our nukes.
We did what we were supposed to do.
We have done everything you asked us to do, and all we want to do is be part of the West. We want to be part of NATO. And maybe the West doesn't want that because it's too big of a problem, and it seems to poke Russia in the eye. Russia gets really, really upset every time the West gets too close, and especially when it has anything to do with missiles and warheads.
What the UN Ambassador Nikki Haley said about basically we're concerned about Ukraine and Crimea, is this basically to stop everything cold and say don't do anything more? Or is this to push Russia back? The other issue is the Pentagon has sent a number of trainers to the Ukraine to help. Some people are arguing in the Pentagon, and clearly many in Ukraine will want this, some heavier weapons to help in their fight against these Russian-backed rebels. Will that happen or not happen? That's going to be an interesting question.
I would doubt that happens given that Obama had the authority to send lethal weapons to Ukraine also. Congress has wanted them to do more for a long time, and the Obama administration said, no way, we're not going to stir that pot. It's really easy to provoke Russia. If Russia sees missiles in Romania, which is why NATO canceled a meeting with Ukraine that it was supposed to have, this week because they were going to talk about those. Those systems are, to safeguard against any sort of ballistic missiles that could come from Iran, not Russia, but it could technically be, used for Russia too. They get upset. You send any sort of You send any sort of lethal aid to Ukraine,
weapons,
right? They could fire a hole through a Russian tank, or anything like that. They'll get really, really upset, and they may come and completely overwhelm Ukraine before they can actually even.
You can never give them enough to push back the Russian.
No, because Russia acts ahead of time.
Yeah. Before we end this hour, and we're almost up to the top of the hour, I've noticed that our listeners have been asking about Ukraine. They've been asking a lot about Russia, about Yemen. Very few have been asking about Australia. And this call with the Prime Minister, we almost ended the hour, or at least it hasn't been coming to me. I'm sure people are interested in this. Before we end the hour, I just wonder, in terms of this conversation between Donald Trump and Malcolm Turnbull, the Prime Minister of Australia, and Enrique Peña Nieto, the President of Mexico, this larger concern about diplomacy being this art that the president has to learn on the job. what perspective should we put this all in? There's a lot going on in the world right now. How big a deal is it really that the president maybe hasn't quite learned his P's and Q's in having a phone call with another head of state? Is it really that big a deal, Shane?
I think it is a big deal in terms of how we generally practice diplomacy and the continuity from one administration to another. I mean, a president is there to keep the word of previous administrations because it's the word of the United States. It's not so much that he's ripping up all the contracts and starting anew, and that's something that President Trump hasn't really seemed to reckon with yet. But I think we also need to view this through the lens of Donald Trump is a masterful producer. He is a television producer, and igniting all of these spats with people and then coming out on Twitter the next day and saying, oh, no, it wasn't like that. It was fake news, and Turnbull's saying the right things.
He tweeted that this is fake news as well, this Australia controversy.
This is spectacle, and we need to remember that this is intentional. He's doing this on purpose.
But to take on one of America's greatest allies, Australia, just it doesn't. It just, you don't know what to say about it. There were 270 soldiers, Australian soldiers, in Afghanistan right now helping with this U.S.-led mission. To take him on over an agreement that he worked out with the United States is just, I don't know what to say about it. It's stunning.
I would just add that I'm more concerned, I guess, about the content of what he says in these blustery speeches, right? I mean, look, Australia, it's refugees. He's already said he doesn't want to take refugees. Australia wasn't exactly treating those refugees great anyway. But Mexico, he said we might send troops over the border to Mexico. That's an invasion. You got to be careful when you're talking tough that you don't do something that's like, whoa, what about Mexican sovereignty?
So what you're saying is we will never run out of things to talk about on the Friday News Roundup.
That's right.
That's right.
Karin Demerjen is a reporter for The Washington Post. Thank you, Karin.
Thank you.
Shane Harris is a senior writer at The Wall Street Journal. Thanks, Shane.
Thank you.
And NPR's Pentagon correspondent, Tom Bowman. Tom, thank you.
Great to be here.
Please do subscribe to 1A's podcast on iTunes or whatever app you like. If you do so, please write us a review and share the episode with your friends, and you'll find even more great podcasts at npr.org/podcasts. 1A comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for listening. This is 1A.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Visit St. Pete Clearwater, home to white sand Gulf beaches 90 minutes west of Orlando, and glass art at the Chihuly Collection, now open in a new downtown